Charleston, South Carolina. December nights here carried a weight heavier than the fog that clung to its streets. The lamps flickered dimly, halos of weak light pressed against the shadows, while the damp scent of wood and brine drifted from the harbor. If you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the faint drag of chains across cobblestones, the echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to the living. Through this silence walked Elijah Williams. He did not move like a free man, though. His posture betrayed something more than submission. His eyes, dark and unyielding, carried a secret, and with every step, his heart beat like a muffled drum. Few in Charleston would have looked at him twice. Another enslaved man bound to a wealthy household, another shadow swallowed by a city built on shadows. But those who did notice spoke of a quiet fire in his gaze, the kind that flickers long, before it burns. At his side, unseen in that moment, but always near in spirit, was Thomas. Younger than Elijah by a year, Thomas had a smile that seemed reckless in a place designed to erase joy. He laughed when others dared not, a laugh that broke through the suffocating silence of the quarters like a hymn unsanctioned. To Elijah, that sound was life itself, a defiance against despair. In Thomas, he found something the world insisted. He could never have tenderness, trust, and a love forbidden by every law, both written and unspoken. They met in glances first, in the brushing of hands while working, in the comfort of a shared silence at night when the overseers finally slept. Their bond was carved from fragments of stolen time, hidden beneath fear, yet undeniable. Imagine the danger. In a world where even a whisper of affection between two enslaved men could invite punishment worse than death, they chose to hold on to one another. They chose laughter when sorrow was safer. But every stolen joy has its shadow. Eyes in Charleston always watched. Overseers lingered, neighbors whispered, and the master, Elijah's master, began to notice that to him, Thomas was no man. He was property. And Elijah's affection was not love in his eyes, but betrayal, an insult to his authority. The cruelty that followed did not fall upon Elijah first. It fell upon Thomas. The master's rage descended with a precision sharpened by contempt. What happened that night shattered Elijah's fragile world, tearing away the only light he had ever known. And yet, in the ruins of grief, something else began to grow. Not despair, not surrender, but a silence colder than the winter air, a silence that carried within it a vow. Because the master believed himself untouchable. He believed his cruelty would vanish into the night, unchallenged, unremembered. But Elijah Williams was watching, and he would not forget. The streets of Charleston did not mark the moment his heart shifted from sorrow to vengeance. No church bells tolled, no neighbors stirred. But in the stillness, in that damp December air, a decision was made. One night soon, the silence would break. And when it did, the city would remember a scream that cut deeper than chains. Charleston, in the mid-19th century, was a city of masks. By day, its streets shone with the polish of wealth-grand houses, lined with white columns, balconies, draped in iron lacework, and the fragrance of magnolia drifting through manicured gardens. Carriages rattled across cobblestones, carrying ladies in silks and gentlemen in tailored coats. From the harbor came the creak of masts and the salt-stung air of ships heavy with cargo. To the visitor, Charleston seemed a paradise of refinement. But beneath its elegance was blood. Rice and cotton had built the city's fortune, and with every brick laid and every field harvested, the labor of enslaved men and women anchored its prosperity. Behind the polished windows of Broad Street and Meeting Street, human misery remained hidden, yet never far from sight. At night, the rhythm of chains and the crack of whips echoed through the air, faint but undeniable. The wealth that Charleston boasted was nothing more than flesh transmuted into coin. Elijah Williams was born into this world, his fate decided before his first breath. He entered life in bondage, cradled not by family, but by the system that claimed his body. Records of his birth were ink on a ledger, not memory in a parent's arms. As a boy, he was sold south, torn from kin he would never know. His name passed from one master's lips to another. Labor bent his body early, carving calluses into hands that once reached for comfort. And yet, even under such weight, Elijah carried a gentleness. His voice was soft, his temper measured, his spirit quietly resilient. His master, however, was a man of another kind. To Charleston's elite, he appeared charming, hosting dinners under glittering chandeliers, quoting scripture with practiced conviction, raising glasses of wine in polished toasts. Neighbors spoke of his generosity, his refinement, his place among the respected. But behind closed doors, that mask fell away. In the quarters, in the fields, cruelty was his true language. He wielded power with precision, inflicting punishment, not for correction, but for pleasure. His presence carried the sour scent of liquor and the quiet dread of those who served him. For Elijah, every glance from him was a reminder that mercy had no place in this house. And yet, even in darkness, a spark had kindled. Thomas. He was broad-shouldered, quick-witted, his laughter carrying a warmth that seemed impossible in such a place. He had an irreverence about him, as if refusing to let his spirit be broken, no matter how tightly the chains clinked. When others bowed their heads, Thomas raised his eyes, and when silence was safest, he dared to laugh. To Elijah, he was more than a companion in toil. He was a shield, a confidant, a light in a life that offered none. Their bond began in fragments, a hand brushing another while carrying timber, a glance exchanged while laboring in fields, sweat streaking across their backs under the relentless sun. At night, when the overseers retreated and the quarters settled into uneasy rest, Elijah would lean close, his shoulder against Thomas's. Words were dangerous, but silence held its own language. Theirs was a love spoken in breath, in heartbeat, in the tremor of a hand against another in the dark. Yet even as they carved out these stolen moments, danger lingered. Every sound seemed sharper when it came from their corner of the quarters. Every footstep outside the door was a threat. The moonlight, slipping through cracks in the wooden slats, was their only witness, casting pale silver across faces that dared to smile. Do you hear it? The whip cracking in the distance, echoing through fields of cane and cotton. The sound carried through the night, a reminder that love was a rebellion, that tenderness was treason. And in Charleston, treason was not forgiven. For a time, their secret held. For a time, their silence shielded them. But silence is fragile. And in Charleston, eyes always watched, and whispers traveled faster than the tide. Theirs was a bond, hidden in shadows, but shadows cannot hold back cruelty forever. And when discovery came, it came not as a whisper, but as a storm. At first, the warnings came quietly. Overseers lingered near the fields longer than usual, their eyes narrowing whenever Elijah and Thomas stood too close. In the quarters, whispers began to circulate, subtle, nervous, the kind that stopped. When footsteps approached, fear makes people speak, and fear makes them fall silent even faster. For Elijah, every laugh shared with Thomas now carried a shadow. Each smile was followed by a pause, a glance over the shoulder. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, thick with suspicion. But the quiet did not last, the master noticed. His gaze sharpened during the evening roll call, holding on Elijah's face just a moment too long. At suppers, he drank more deeply, his lips curling when Elijah entered the room. A man like him needed little evidence, only an excuse. And soon the excuse arrived. One night, the quarters stirred with commotion. Lanterns flared, overseers dragged Thomas into the yard, their boots striking against the packed dirt. Elijah followed, heart hammering, though he dared not move closer. The master stepped into the circle of firelight, his fine coat brushing the ground, his voice laced with venom. He declared Thomas guilty, not of theft, not of defiance, but of sin. A sin unnamed but understood. A sin the master would not let pass. The first lash tore through the night like thunder. The sound cracked against flesh, the echo rattling through the still air. Elijah flinched as though the blow had landed on him. Thomas cried out once, then clenched his teeth, refusing to scream again. But the whip fell again, and again, splintering skin, painting the dirt with blood. Each strike carried not just punishment but humiliation, a reminder to every eye watching that the master's power reached beyond the body into the soul. Elijah's nails dug into his palms until they bled. He wanted to move, to throw himself forward, but the circle of overseers stood firm, muskets glinting in the firelight. His body trembled with rage, but fear rooted his feet. So he watched. He watched as Thomas's back split open beneath leather. He watched as the master's face twisted into a cruel smile, feeding on pain. He watched until Thomas's knees buckled, until his body slumped, until the last breath left his chest. When silence finally fell, it was not relief. It was suffocation. Thomas lay broken in the dirt, his laughter extinguished, his warmth bled into the soil. Elijah could not move. He stood frozen, his ears ringing, the copper scent of blood filling his lungs. Around him, the others lowered their heads, too afraid to meet his eyes. The night closed in, heavy and endless. Grief consumed him first, a wave that threatened to pull him under. In the darkness of the quarters, he wept without sound, his body shaking as though the tears themselves burned. But grief did not linger. It hardened. It sharpened. By the next night, sorrow had twisted into something colder. Where once he saw Thomas's smile, he now saw his broken body. Where once he felt warmth, he felt fire. And so Elijah began too. Prepare. He spoke to no one, yet every action carried purpose. He sharpened tools in secret, steel whispering against stone, until sparks danced in the dark. He whispered prayers not of mercy, but of vengeance, words carried only to the dead. In silence, he rehearsed each step across creaking wood, each breath held against discovery. His body remembered Thomas's screams, and in that memory, his hands no longer trembled. Each night the quarters settled into uneasy sleep. Elijah lay awake, the flicker of a candle casting shadows across his face. In those shadows, Thomas appeared, smiling, speaking without words. And Elijah would answer, not with voice, but with steel. The master believed his violence had ended the matter, that the lash had buried love, that death had silenced rebellion. But he was wrong, because Elijah Williams had changed. And though no bell tolled, though no neighbor stirred, the night itself seemed to wait. By the time the sun set again, vengeance had already begun to take root. And soon it would rise like a storm no one in Charleston could ignore. The night had no stars. Clouds smothered the moon, leaving Charleston drowned in a darkness so thick it seemed the city itself held its breath. The master's house, usually glowing like a lantern above the fields, was now silent, its grand windows unlit, its long columns casting only faint silhouettes against the night sky. Inside, the remnants of a feast clung to the air. Roasted pork, wine spilled on polished floors, the sickly sweetness of tobacco smoke drifting from extinguished cigars. And somewhere above, in the master's chamber, arrogance lay curled in drunken slumber. Elijah waited in the quarters until even the last overseer's footsteps faded. His hands trembled only once when he traced the steel he had sharpened until the blade was thin as breath. He whispered Thomas's name under his breath, not as plea, but as vow. Every heartbeat was thunder, but each step was steady as he crossed the yard and pressed his palm against the great door. Wood groaned softly, like it too resisted what was coming. But the quiet did not last. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the sense of spilled liquor and meat turned cold. Shadows sprawled across velvet curtains, and portraits of men who had grown rich from blood. Elijah moved with the precision of silence itself. Every creak of the staircase was a drumbeat, every whisper of his clothing against the banister a reminder that there could be no turning back. Did he feel fear? Perhaps. But fear had long been eclipsed by something sharper, something colder. At the threshold of the master's chamber, Elijah paused. The man who had stolen Thomas's breath now slept. In careless abandon, one arm draped across silk sheets, mouth parted in drunken slumber. Candle stubs flickered low on the table, casting the room in dim amber, gilding cruelty and soft light. Elijah stepped forward, the floorboards shivering beneath him. The master stirred, his lips smacking with sleep, until his eyes cracked open. For a heartbeat, confusion clouded them. Then he saw Elijah, framed in shadow, steel glinting in his hand. The master's breath caught. He tried to speak, but words tangled into a strangled sound. Elijah's gaze held no plea, no apology, only judgment. The blade descended. A scream ripped through the chamber, sharp and raw, tearing into the silence like thunder. It was not the command of a master, but the howl of prey. Elijah pressed forward, steel carving through arrogance. The master thrashed, his limbs clawing at sheets, wood splintering as the bedframe groaned beneath his struggle. Wine and blood mingled on the floor, the iron tongue thickening in the air until each breath was fire in Elijah's lungs. He did not stop. Each motion was deliberate, each strike a sentence carried out. The master's hands, once quick to grip a whip, now trembled and clawed uselessly at the air. Flesh quivered under cold steel, the body writhing, but Elijah's arms did not falter. He had waited too long, endured too much. The chamber became a theater of agony. Walls seemed to close in, pulsing with echoes of wetness on the floor, of steel striking bone. Curtains darkened with spatter, portraits stared wide-eyed as if bearing witness to the collapse of their legacy. And through it all, Elijah breathed heavy, his chest heaving, his face damp with sweat and tears. He was no longer the servant who bent beneath orders. He was something else entirely, a force born of grief, sharpened into vengeance. The master's cries weakened, slipping from defiance to pleading. His voice cracked on words Elijah did not hear, or perhaps chose not to hear. The language of cruelty had no wake now. With each gasp, power shifted. The man who once ruled by fear now drowned in it, his body failing beneath the hands of the one he thought powerless. When silence finally threatened to return, Elijah slowed. He pressed the blade once more, not in haste, but in ritual. His breath matched the rhythm of his strokes, steady, deliberate. It was not frenzy, it was judgment. Then, at last, the struggle ended. The chamber, once filled with wealth and feasting, now stank of blood and sweat, of liquor spilled and life extinguished. The sheets were torn, wood splintered, the walls marked forever. Elijah stood above the ruin, his hands trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of what he had done. His chest rose and fell, each breath ragged, each exhale carrying years of swallowed rage. The master lay still, his eyes glassed in death, his mouth parted in silence that could never command again. For a long moment, Elijah only listened. The crackle of the last candle, the soft drip of blood onto wood, his own heartbeat pounding against his ribs like a drum of war. And beneath it all, he imagined he could hear Thomas's voice, soft, fleeting, carried in the hush of the night. The deed was complete. The house, once a monument to Southern grandeur, was now stained beyond cleansing. The walls would never again echo with the master's laughter, nor the crack of his whip. Instead, they carried the memory of screams that clawed into the night and died there. Elijah stood in the silence he had made. His blade, slick and red, hung at his side. His breath fogged the air as if the house itself had grown cold. He looked once more at the ruin on the bed, and though no smile touched his lips, there was no fear in his eyes. The night outside waited, and by the time the sun rose, Charleston would never be the same. The silence after violence is heavier than the act itself. Elijah stood in the master's chamber, chest heaving, his breath fogging in the air as if winter had seeped into the walls. The bed was torn apart, sheets shredded and darkened. Master's body twisted among them. Blood clung to Elijah's hands, warm at first, then cooling, sticky against his skin. He stared at them as if they no longer belonged to him. The tremor that once threatened to undo him was gone. His hands were steady now. For a long moment he listened. The room whispered with dripping, each drop marking time like a clock no longer bound to mercy. Then, slowly, he turned away. The floor groaned as he crossed it, footsteps soft but final, the weight of judgment trailing behind him. The house seemed to exhale as he descended the stairs. Chandeliers hung silent, their crystals catching faint traces of moonlight. Portraits of men who had ruled from that house for generations loomed in shadows, their painted eyes wide with unspoken witness. Elijah's blade, slick and dull in the candlelight, swung at his side with each step. When the great door opened, the world beyond seemed untouched. The night air wrapped around him, cold, crisp, and strangely clean. Crickets sang. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. Charleston slept, oblivious to the ruin inside its grandest home. Elijah walked into the yard, the earth damp beneath his feet, and breathed deeply, as if the night itself offered absolution. But the quiet did not last. At dawn, the sky bled pale over the fields, mist curling low among the cane. Overseers arrived. First, their boots thudding against earth still wet with dew. The silence broke with shouts hoarse, frantic, ripping across the plantation like a storm. Soon neighbors gathered, their fine coats drawn tight, their whispers sharper than knives. The master mutilated. His chamber, desecrated, his power, undone in a single night. Fear spread faster than the news itself. At taverns, voices lowered to hisses. In churches, prayers swelled louder, desperate to drown the truth. Women clutched their children tighter, men tightened grips on rifles, all glancing at their own slaves with suspicion. Was it rebellion? Was it only the beginning? The city's elegance cracked beneath the weight of dread. Through it all, Elijah did not run. When they came for him, he did not resist. Chains rattled as they bound his wrists, the sound sharp in the morning stillness. He walked between them without struggle, his head lifted, his eyes fixed forward. Some swore they saw a calm on his face, a serenity that unsettled more than rage would have. The overseers whispered of madness, neighbors of possession, but Elijah spoke no word. His silence was heavier than any testimony, more cutting than any confession. To those who watched, he seemed less a man than an omen, a shadow that had stepped from legend into flesh. Church bells tolled above the city, their sound rolling over rooftops and cobblestones. To mourn? To warn? None could say. But beneath their chime lay something colder, the recognition that vengeance had come from the very soil they had tried to chain. As Elijah passed through Charleston streets, shackles clinking, people averted their eyes. Mothers pulled children. Close, men spat in the dust, yet none could silence the question rising in every heart. If one man could do this, how many more carried such fire inside them? By the time the sun reached its peak, the city was restless, its grandeur dimmed by whispers it could not control. And Elijah, bound and unbowed, walked as though the path before him had always been written. The silence of vengeance had ended. But what came after was only beginning. The gallows loomed against the Charleston sky, its wooden beams rough, its rope swaying faintly in the salt wind drifting from the harbor. To some, it was justice. To others, it was a warning carved in wood and rope. But to Elijah, it was only the end of a path he had already chosen. Crowds gathered, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their murmurs buzzing like hornets. Women clutched handkerchiefs, men muttered curses, children clung to skirts, all drawn to witness vengeance repaid by vengeance. Overseers barked at the enslaved, forced to stand in line, their eyes downcast, though their ears caught every word. Elijah was brought forward, chains rattling in rhythm with his steps. Yet he did not stumble. He did not bow. His posture was straight, his gaze steady, his silence unbroken. To many in the crowd, that silence was arrogance. To others, it was madness. But to those who watched from the margins, hearts beating in the shadows, it was something else, defiance, carved in flesh. The rope was placed around his neck, its fibers coarse against his skin. The wood beneath him creaked. A hush fell over. The crowd, broken only by the groan of the gallows shifting in the wind. Somewhere, a gull cried above the harbor, its wings flashing white against the pale morning sky. Preachers spoke of sin, of unnatural abomination, of vengeance born from corruption. They branded Elijah not as man, but as warning. But in the slave quarters, whispers moved like fire. His name passed from mouth to mouth, not as curse, but as story. They spoke of the love he had carried, the cruelty he had endured, and the night he rose in shadow to answer loss with justice. When the trapdoor fell, the rope snapped taut with a sound sharp as thunder. The creak of rope, the gasp of the crowd, the stillness that followed, all settled into the air like smoke. Elijah's body swayed, but his silence remained. That silence would echo longer than any sermon. Charleston's beauty endured the glitter of its mansions, the perfume of gardens, the polished cobblestones beneath carriage wheels. Yet beneath that sheen lay a memory no wealth could scrub clean. The scream in the master's house, the mutilated body, the gallows that tried to erase what had been done. Elijah Williams was buried not with honor, but with haste, hidden beneath earth that would not keep him quiet. For in the murmurs of the enslaved, his shadow lived on. His story became both terror and inspiration, a reminder of the fragile line between love and vengeance, between silence and fire. Even now, when the wind moves through Charleston's live oaks, when the salt air carries whispers through narrow streets, some say his name rides upon it, not as plea, not as curse, but as a ghostly reminder that chains do not silence forever. So the question remains, was Elijah Williams a monster, or was he something else entirely?